Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of salutations with also welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan, Watty, and thank you for joining me today as we continue our great adventure. And I am missing my plus one for today, my co-host, Russ. He is somewhere out there in the ethos. Maybe we'll find him one day. But for those who are first-time joiners, let me introduce first, not myself, but Producer Jeff, because Producer Jeff is awesome, right? Thank you, Producer Jeff. And if I take that step back, I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And also, may I add in a high welcome to all of those whose first time it is joining in. And if it's first time, feel free to put in, hey, where are you from? Where are you tuning in from? That's kind of a interesting thing. And also, we always come with two questions here. So the where you're tuning in from, but also, let's say, a little bit of an icebreaker question, a little bit of a warm-up. And today's, we need a little bit of warm-up on the East Coast. So we'll say, hey, what's your favorite breakfast food? I know this is one of those topics that can cause a lot of tension in the room, especially when you're trying to order breakfast for everybody. But I would say mine has to be a bacon, sausage, and cheese, no egg on an everything bagel with some butter on it. I know, it's a good thing, right? Not a good thing for calories, but it's a good thing for breakfast. So feel free to put in the chat what yours is that you get on a regular basis or semi-regular basis. And today's episode is going to be an interesting one because we're not focusing so much on just a service, but more of a service, right? I tried to come up with something clever, but it didn't work. I didn't have enough coffee yet. I'm already down to 2 hearts on my cup. So we're going to be speaking about a certain managed services of the AWS variety. But as those continue to come in, I would say here, Ari, the best thing is a breakfast burrito. Yes. A breakfast burrito is great. It's also interesting who makes it. That's a big thing. So I digress. I can speak about breakfast all day. But today's topic kind of stems from where we were coming from last week, right? Because last week we started to delve into, hey, how do we enable some autocasting in our environments? And autocast, if we use that as an RPG term, is more of how do we achieve security automation so that we see that achievement pop up on the screen saying, hey, stuff works. That's an interesting thing. But as always, it's dangerous to go alone. So why not take a friend? And that's where this follow-up episode comes from. How do you restore your mana, your spirit, your security enthusiasm? Well, you close out tickets. And close out tickets, it helps, right? You see the ticket queue go down and hopefully not spring right back up. And that's where we start to delve into AWS Managed Services. And for those who do not know with AWS Managed Services, I think the best place to start out, the best intro to start out with is kind of diving into a page. So let me pull up that page. If anybody out there is using managed services, feel free to also comment. I always like to see how much feedback we get from it. But here we go, right here onto the screen. Let us pop up. So the overview, always a great thing, especially when you're going through the documentation of, hey, what does this do from a service to a service? So using standard AWS services offers guidance and execution of operational best practices. And this is that key word that we specialize automations. Kind of see how we're weaving in the two together, right? It's almost like this was planned out a little bit. But what we really have to think about is, hey, why? And look, the top bullet, because it's the top priority, security. 150 plus managed guardrails and security checks. I think that really sets the stage of, hey, why managed services is great, right? Because if you go down the list, I know Russ is here in spirit because there's some incident management. I know there's some IR happening somewhere in the world and some automation that's happening right behind it, hopefully. So really what I wanted to touch upon today in today's episode is we really wanted to see, hey, what leads someone down the path of choosing this service? Is it, okay, we don't have enough people? Or is it, hey, I don't know about AWS? Or is it something else? And when I hear about how to choose a service, oftentimes I think of like a character select screen. Right? It just pops up. Think of your favorite show, think of your favorite game, think of your favorite whatever with the grid, the 3x3 grid, right? So I go to more the fantasy aspect of, hey, you choose your class and your party composition, right? What if AWS Managed Services, is the class? How is your party put together, pretty much? That's an interesting question and kind of interesting way to think about it. The other way is, okay, how do I kind of buff up my defenses? Is there some automated compliance, some security guardrails that can help me clear out some of the quest log, aka the ticket queue? Because the ticket queue, I would like to see at 0 in everybody's environment. Not 0 because everything's not configured, but 0 from the perspective of, hey, we went through and we did some things today, right? How do we handle that incident management, the patch management, to the point that we can think about leveling up? We can reduce the grind and more maximize our security XP, right? It all seems to flow together a little bit. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves, especially when it comes to this, is one, hi, how's it going? And also, two, when we think of just what is the most common misconfiguration that you have to remediate within your environment? Interesting thought. Because you could go a couple different ways with this. Maybe it's a public S3 bucket. Hopefully not. Unencrypted resources. Disabled logging. Or maybe a little bit of all of the above. I think that's an interesting place to kind of start out and think about, because if we have something misconfigured in the environment, what's the first thing to let us know that that is the case? And I take that dramatic pause because there's a couple different ways you can go about it. And hopefully there's a lot of things that come in, and maybe, hopefully, some of those things are automated. But I digress, because we're talking about creating our party to handle these items. How do we, get to the point that we chose our class, our party composition? Well, let's think about it, and let's think about it from the AMS perspective. So part of it is understanding, hey, what is the operating model of AMS? Well, essentially, AMS deploys kind of a multi-account landing zone using Control Tower as some of the foundation, right? So essentially, when you have Control Tower, your accounts for logging, your security, your networking, and shared services, kind of there's a cohesive nature to it. And each of these managed accounts, they kind of follow a standardized VPC design. That's one of the methods. But what we've seen in modern takes with AMS is meeting the customer where they are within their security maturity journey. So what you tend to see is, hey, if I have a customer that has a Control Tower environment and they have their account structure and they have an LZA, say they're using Landing Zone Accelerator. Okay, now how can we fit into your flow? Interesting aspect, because you have your accounts, but what happens when something comes into your environment? And that's kind of where AMS sits down to understand kind of your workflows, and they have the different offerings that come with it. But I'm not so much delving into the offerings, but the reason why people head towards using a managed service, because a managed service can be powerful. Right? Think of any one of those games where there's an automated character that joins your party. And oftentimes you can't control them at all. And they're like, oh, go this way. And they just go around a different way. But unexpected to you, the route they took to complete whatever task helped to optimize what you were doing because you didn't have to focus on them. They had a task in their head, they executed it, which overall kind of freed you up to do other things. And those are the best type of party members, where you get to the point where you set the fundamental items up of, hey, we're going to focus on this. And they understand, okay, got you. You don't have to prescribe 100% which way to go. You can do it in such a way that you're shifting some of the responsibility, some of the thinking, some of the triaging to them, right? Because in a standard AWS model, you're responsible for everything from the OS patching through your application security. With AMS, there's a middle layer in there, right? Think of your OS management, your patching, your backup, your monitoring, and the way to shift that responsibility so you can focus on something else within the environment. Maybe some agentic agents. Yeah, just put it out there. But these are things that you can start to think of, hey, we didn't have time to think of step 4, 5, and 6 because we were stuck on 2. And that 2 might have been, oh, how do we understand the sprawl of our environment to the point that we can regularly patch things? How can we come up with the cadence? How can we figure out the monitoring? And the great thing with AMS, they integrate with your existing security controls. So it's not that it's replacing your security services. Think your guard duty, think of your inspector, config. No, it enhances them by actively monitoring and triaging and responding to the findings generated by the guard duty, the security hub, the config. I think those are all important considerations because when you're trying to look at your overall account state, I think it's important to say, hey, what tools can we optimize the best? Because when you are new to the AWS cloud, you see all of these different tools that are really great. But if you don't have something like a target state security strategy, what can sometimes happen is you can put all of the native services, all the third-party services, and maybe you're not monitoring for things like maybe cost, little things like that pop up maybe at a later date after the initial period. All right, these are things that you should be thinking out ahead of time within your plan. And not to say you don't have a sandbox to play around with different services, but when you're looking to optimize, really look at your overall flow, not just from a services standpoint, not from a technology standpoint, but a people standpoint, right? People go on vacation, people have fun, people go and try to learn things. So an important consideration is, how do I empower my environment to a point that it has some redundancies, it has some checks and balances and all those good things in between, especially if something happens within the environment? How are items triaged, especially by severity? How are they escalated or remediated? So some key points is you can set up your relationship with AMS in such a way that they're not going to touch anything until you agree to it. So if something is detected and they say, here, these are the remediation steps. That's great. You can take care of it, or we can take care of it. And that's all part of the process of how they go about, let's say, account and infrastructure onboarding. And there's a whole intake process, let's say, right? And a way for them to bring the accounts online. And I think a future side quest is going to have somebody on from the AMS side, just kind of speak through some of these different items. But we wanted to dip our toes in today and kind of say, hey, what leads people down this decision? The other item, it kind of faces, it puts into place some change management. What I mean by that is every infrastructure AMS environment is tracked, right? What we often see sometimes with customer environments, while they're trying to accelerate quickly, sometimes the documentation, sometimes the process and procedures are a work in progress. That's something we're going to do after the go live. This is something that we're going to take care of in Q3 or Q4, and does it get taken care of? Well, I'll let the chat comment on that, but the item of having somebody else that can take care of certain things frees you up to, one, do the documentation in order for them to help take care of some more things. It's just like a nice cycle that keeps leveling up your environment's posture to the point that, hey, you can have things set up that's tailored to your environment. So do you want something more advanced where you need a full operational management piece, or you need something to accelerate your journey? It's all important parts and things to consider. But I think one of the key items that I would say is, hey, what are those use cases? And that's what we keep diving into, is those use cases. So when you look at, hey, what are some of the use cases? Monitoring observability. I think this is one of the items that we've seen customers move towards a lot. Between monitoring observability and configuration compliance, usually from my peer review as the professional services side of the house, is usually the monitoring and the responses that come from that monitoring. Because what we often see is when the customer's in their journey to the cloud, is they're setting up all these different systems, they're trying to figure out AWS, the individuals may still be building upon, okay, what is identity within the environment? What type of alert should I set up? What do I do next? All pieces of the puzzle that, hey, we're trying to figure out piece by piece. And sometimes, you have professional services and you have different mechanisms in place. But something like a managed service can help you be that extra party member, right? So these are important parts to consider when you're looking into your just overall journey. Because when you first start out within your environment, or even if you're 10 years into your environment, hopefully 10 years, you have some of the fundamental guardrails that we're speaking in place. If not, there's a lot of people that can have conversations with you on ways to do so. And there's some previous episodes that you can watch too. But some of the speed run, the quick, fast spark notes of things is, hey, you have preventative guardrails in place. You want some automated compliance. Well, how do you get to that automated compliance to a point where you have these enchantments and buffs that help just make your environment a little bit more magical? Well, we spoke about in previous episodes, SCPs. They act as hard boundaries in your organization. And what does that do? That means, hey, even the account administrator cannot override these. They're the strongest preventative control in AWS, I would say. Yes, they are the Hulk of AWS, but one of the things is AMS can help you with some SCPs, right? Think of the common things just from a attack surface standpoint. If somebody were to get into your environment, what is the first thing they do? Hey, can we turn off some logs? The CloudTrail, the VPC flow logs, maybe create some IAM users, or have some console accesses outside of the federated approval. Those are things that you want to restrict using service control policies. Because if you could restrict those items, now you have some other things to look at, right? The fundamentals, we usually call them kind of the baseline security SCPs, where you want to make sure that you have something in place to prevent those items, right? Think of privilege escalation all the way down to just somebody sitting and just having a look into your environment and your patterns. Those are things that we're trying to stop. And the part that comes with that is the detective control side of the house. So when you think of detective controls, you should automatically start to think, okay, these are the things that go bleep and bloop, right? These are the things that make the noise. And how do they make noise is important, right? Because if something were not to match up from, let's say, a severity standpoint, how do you handle that? What I mean is if something is like, hey, you got root account access, and then all of a sudden you heard just applause, the severity of that doesn't match the musical tone of that. So what we're trying to get to is making sure that your environment's in sync with your overarching flow. So if a severe item comes in, it is triaged appropriately. And AMS can help with those different items, especially when it comes to, let's say, conformance packs. From a compliance standpoint, bunch of conformance packs that you can implement, understand, maintain. Yes, right? You have some config rules that are mapped to specific compliance frameworks, which always help because, hey, if it ties directly to a regulatory control, that often makes a little bit of the audit season a little bit easier. The other piece of that is making sure that some drift doesn't happen within the environment. What do you mean by drift? Well, let's say you have some type of S3 bucket and it's changed from private to public. Should be a lot of flags happening within your environment at that point in time. And that's what we're trying to get to is how do we set up those flags? And who is going to recognize those flags is another important part of the puzzle. And feel free, comment in chat, what are some of the flags that you notice within your environment that sometimes pop up and you're just like, how did this happen? Or maybe they didn't pop up. Maybe they didn't trigger. And the same question of how did this happen? It's often something we hear from an escalation standpoint. And the Russ spirit that we channel often says the same thing. So what we're trying to get to is if we have some type of compliance monitoring, some type of like, hey, how do we get to the part of understanding what do we do when it comes to automation then? Because we can have automation to the point of, hey, something comes into the environment, it's taken care of before somebody even wakes out of bed. But what do we do when we get to the point of, hey, there needs to be a human in the loop, right? It's something, one of those questions that maybe we should get to, right? So what do we start to go down? It's an interesting path. So think of this example. You have an EBS volume detected without encryption, right? Can you have automation that can document and snapshot the volume and create an encrypted copy and swap it onto the instance and delete the unencrypted copy, all those things? That would be a great automation, right? So that's the kind of piece to think about, right? And we have a question. And man says, what's your thought on SRE? So site reliability engineering. See, I'm losing hearts as we're speaking. Well, I think it's a needed thing, right? So when you get to just a large environment, it's important to understand, hey, what happens with your different workflows, right? You have mission critical items. If something were to happen, what's the overall process of making sure that, hey, our SLAs are met and our items are continuing to run? So it's important from that aspect. But the other piece of that is how can we get to the point of automation with runbooks and things of that nature from just a security standpoint if something were to happen so it doesn't trigger all those sequencing events, right? Because I always often think of, hey, if you start to fail over your entire environment because it got flooded, right? Let's say DDoS or something along those lines, right? How do we prevent that from happening? Because there might be less resources there and things that are provisioned within your environment, right? So those are all important parts of the puzzle. The other piece of this is just thinking about your overall workflow, right? Because you start to come at it from either DevOps perspective, DevSecOps perspective, or just overall, hey, what is our workflow perspective, right? But thank you for that question, man. And I think as we start to go through and touch upon these questions a little bit more, I think the next step is really to dive into, hey, identity. Dramatic pause. Identity. I say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. Why? Because making sure that, let's say, permission boundaries are in place for all the user roles. Making sure that there's effective permissions that are constrained by those boundaries. So if you have something like, I don't know, a pass role, that pass role cannot grant access in such a way that it elevates itself from, hey, just a regular user to an administrative user, right? And going down the route, I also answered a question from Punch. My boss prefers to have automation on cloud agnostic platform rather than stick to a provider like does managed services provide any solutions for the same? So I think there's a couple of pieces to this. So automation on cloud agnostic. So what is the automation coming to from the standpoint of how does it get triggered, right? What I mean by that is if you have 3 clouds, let's say you have your AWS cloud, your Google cloud, and you have your Azure, right? So if you have an application within AWS, let's say you have a control tower environment. That control tower environment now sends logs to a centralized logging archive account. And that centralized logging archive account, now you can centralize your logs into, let's say, an S3 bucket. Or maybe you can push your S3 bucket logs all the way to something like a Cribble, right? Or a security lake if you stick on the AWS side. And then from there, go into your SIM, right? So you still need to output your logs. And then from there, you can go to your automation standpoint. But I think when you think of managed services, they're looking at that overarching structure to the point of, hey, if there's something alerting from your AWS environment, they can help from that standpoint, right? So those are the things to consider within that. So thank you for that question. I love the multi-tiered questions, right? Because we can dive in. That's what side quests are here for. I would also say evidence collection is also what compliance folks are here for. So when you think of CloudTrail logs and VPC flow logs and everything that, somewhere like AMS can help out with, I think the deeper story is, hey, how do we get to the point of diving a little bit deeper? Well, I think the easiest way to do so is kind of figuring out where we came from and where we're going and what legends of past were there. This is where you cue the dramatic music. So I'm just going to punch on. All right, dramatic music. Yes, dramatic music. Say it 3 times. There we go. So it also gives me a sip of coffee. That's why I do that. But SideQuest Legend has it. Essentially, is the section of our show where we dig into a customer story. And that customer story is something of past where, hey, how did they get out of this? How did they figure it out? How do we mature? So how do we picture this visually? Well, what we have is a SideQuest board. And that SideQuest board is something that I would say is interesting from the standpoint of it looks like a blank environment, right? And yes, dramatic music, yes, right? It's a typical setup, right? It may not have everything. I've seen some reference diagrams like this as well, right? It's like, okay, we have our environment and we have our people, right? So what is it? Well, let's set the scene. So our favorite Castle Forge Studios, right? It's a great made up name. They thought they had conquered the campaign, right? because they migrated their global gaming platform to AWS, let's say 8 months ago. That's a nice even number, because they implemented centralized logging across their 62 game studios, I believe it was. But they started to build their detective controls, their preventative controls, their automations. But now they have SEPs as well. And thank you, Dragonoff, as I take the piece of the Lego to heart. But as we know, that's not where our story ends. It's where it begins. Because when you think of, when does the boss fight show up? As well, when you have the most equipment. So think of it this way. When you start to undergo an audit, when you start to think of, hey, we have technical controls, but how do we continue to build upon this, and who's operating the controls, and who's watching at 3 a.m.? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, especially for a game platform. Because 3 a.m. might be prime time. So if you think of 3 a.m., you have your live game event, and you have, let's say, 8 million concurrent players. Who patches the OS on 4,000 game server instances across multiple regions? Who responds to the guard duty when it fires something like a critical finding on a Saturday morning during a major tournament match? And you kind of see how this is going, because it's not a typical situation. Any little bit can interrupt the flow of gameplay, and that concurrent user count may go down. And that's usually when the security team looks at themselves when the auditor asks that question, because they built a fortress. But how do they continue to maintain this fortress with maybe a skeleton crew that's running 24/7? It's interesting. They built the security controls. They have the guard duty findings. But how do they reduce the grind of an unsustainable operation? And if you see where this question is going, it goes into, hey, is there something out there that can help us? Well, managed services, of course, but there's spoilers, I know. The thing is to think about it from the part of, hey, how do we get additional help? We just need that party member that we spoke about earlier that can go off, kind of do their own thing. They have their lists, their agenda, to get to the part of maybe incident remediation. Or if something pops up, can they give me those different pieces? So if, as we scale this Castle Forge, if they acquire maybe 2 additional game studios, hey, and maybe launch in different regions, now they start to get to the point of, hey, our guild is growing, our place is growing. And the reason why this board isn't that populated, because when you start to think of what populates it, is this exactly. Well, we have our authenticated user in, let's say, our CloudForge studios, right? And they're generating logs. And yeah, that's great. But what happens when maybe you have unauthenticated users trying to hit that S3 bucket for whatever reason? And that kind of triggers a different type of workflow in the environment, to the standpoint of, hey, something's going on in the environment, and guard duty alerts are triggering within the environment. And hey, I thought there was a firewall in place. This conversation sounds familiar, right? Where you say, hey, I thought we have these different mechanisms in place. How do we get to the point of understanding which way do we go within our environment? And this is the critical piece right here. And the reason why I say this is a critical piece is because you can go a couple different directions. Usually we talk about, hey, maybe we just throw down some automation. So if something happens within the environment, we can take a different approach. And that's why I take that dramatic pause. And what is that different approach? Well, it's the moment you say, hey, we need some support, because we still need to build this out. So That's why that piece is missing. How do we get to the point where we build something out? Well, that's kind of where you get another party member. And where is that party member just sitting off screen? Remember, they're doing their own thing, right? To some extent. How can we get to the point where maybe, just maybe, we have somebody that can help us heal the environment, somebody that can help us triage the tickets, somebody that has the healing aura, let's say. Because one of the biggest problems, if we have 8,000 concurrent users on servers, that means we need some fleet-wide patch management. And AMS, that's something they can take care of. Maybe having patch baselines defined per operating system. So if they have Linux 2 for their game servers, great. Now we create a baseline. Windows Server, baseline. And what that helps to do is get everything on a schedule. Everything can take an approach. Because what we're trying to avoid is the music switching tones and going towards something that's a little bit more along the sad route. Because we tried to do this alone, but we were missing some critical, because maybe we grew faster than we knew we were going to. And I think that's where we need to hit that pause game button, right? So, as I like to say, it's kind of like the Zach Morris timeout. Because when we start to think of, hey, that's a lot of things happening within our environment. That's a lot of paths to go down. Because as you recall, we needed some automation, some lambdas. And I can even spare you a step function. But the idea behind this is we're trying to clear our quest log. That's what it boils down to. How do we do that? Well, security incident detection and triage pipeline. I would say those 6 words. So we have something like guard duty in place. Okay, guard duty uses machine learning and it detects anomalies, all those good things, right? But the key piece to this is when it detects an anomaly and it triggers a finding, what happens? If a CloudTrail-based detection happens for unusual API activity patterns, what happens? So with AMS, you're able to take all these different detection signals and kind of triage it into a pipeline of findings where it's not you that's necessarily doing it. There's somebody else. There's that other party member that we're speaking about. And being able to categorize things, critical, high, medium, low, and kind of correlate all these different pieces together so that you have this active pipeline of incident detection and triage management. And I think that boils into an incident response workflow. As I channel my inner Russ, you think about, hey, the NIST SP 861 saying computer security incident handling, right? When you start to think about that, okay, how do you handle incidents in your environment? Is there a process? How many playbooks, how many run books do you have in place? And I would pose that question to chat. Do you have a run book per service, a run book per type of incident? Do you run tabletop exercises on a frequent basis? And not just the yearly, hey, we have to do this for compliance, but is it something that you can do more frequently to the point that you can help maybe get to a point within your environment that you have a process and procedure to follow the whole NIST kind of cycle of going through and updating and building upon the experience points that you have gathered in the past. Right? And that's where I took off the pause game because, hey, it stops being a pause game because it's active. Right? These are escalations that are happening. You start to feel the different severity levels because when an incident happens within the environment, how do you define critical incidents? Right? How do you confirm an active compromise within your environment? It's a key piece. And if you hear my dog, he's also understanding that it's a key piece. And usually that's where you have some of the instant response. There's the CERT team and always great things. And we'll have some sneak previews in the future to have some more conversations there. But part of where we want to get to is that automated containment. Okay? Because once you contain, makes life, I would say, it's a little bit easier, right? Because think of it this way. If you have a bunch of EC2 instances, well, how do you know which one is the one that may be compromised? Because it might look like this. All right, you have 3 items. You have 1 EC2, 3 EC2. And this one might be the one with something on it. But how do you get to that point of isolating that one, right? Once an alert is triggered, do you manually go through and understand? Do you have the security personnel? But if we take it back to our customer story and their use case, if they have 8,000 concurrent players within their environment that's probably spread out across multiple servers, now what is your process and procedure for that? If it's a compromise of IAM user access keys, are they immediately deactivated? Are the active sessions revoked? Do you apply inline deny policies? How do you take care of that? And sometimes you may not know all these different steps being new to the AWS environment. So there are ways that you can kind of go about understanding, kind of picking up on that. But I think if we were to take a little side tangent, or I would say side quest, you can also think about it from a perspective of, hey, let us think about different ways to get to understanding incident response. So there's always the incident response guide. So this is built upon the many, let's say, best practices, learnings, and baselines throughout a number of years within AWS. And usually when you get to this point, I think this is kind of where you start to ask yourself questions of how do we build out an environment? Are we well architected, right? All these are great questions, but these aren't the questions you want to ask at 3 a.m. You want to kind of break out and distill these items into your overall process. And that's where that preparation step comes into play, right? Because you're preparing for stuff within your environment. You're laying down the foundation of the guardrails, the guidelines. And I was looking for another G, but I lost it. But essentially getting to a point of, hey, you prepare and then something happens, then you use that learning in order to develop. And this can come in a number of forms. Usually it comes from, hey, if something happened in the environment, did we have enough logs to detect that something? And it's usually within the guide that says, hey, these are the common logs that you would have, like VPC flow logs and CloudTrail logs and so on and so forth. But it's important to get familiar with this guide, because when you're moving towards leveraging something like an AMS, I think part of the conversation is, how do we handle this in tandem, right? Because this is that other party member, right? Security is a shared responsibility, as it says in the guide. So how do we develop something within our environment from a workflow perspective that everybody has an understanding of? I think that's one of the key items and metrics that we're going towards. So that something if a 0-day happens, now we can get to the point of, okay, I have an understanding of my environment. Maybe we have something like, I don't know, that public S3 bucket. Well, I think if we have an unauthorized user, what can happen with that? And I say that barely being able to say that because a lot can happen with that. But I digress, because what we're trying to get to the point of understanding is that these are the different factors that move people towards having something like AMS, because maybe you don't have all of the guidelines. You may not know the full identity workflow of what happens within your environment, to the point of, hey, if somebody has we'll stick with a pass role, right? If somebody says, hey, can you grant this pass role access within this identity policy? Okay, great. Now that they have that, they could do a privilege escalation. And with that privilege escalation, they get to the point of being able to provision something that maybe doesn't have so much, let's say, boundaries attached to it. And that's where permission boundaries come into my head. I keep saying boundaries subliminally so that you have permission boundaries because you don't want anybody to go past the level that you granted them. But this is all part of, one, the orchestration, two, the automation, and three, just kind of your overarching flow of your environment. And that flow is what AMS comes into and says, hey, these are some of the things that we offer and we do. And what that does, it creates the peace of mind to the standpoint of, hey, now I can take those things back and take it a little bit more under consideration. Because if somebody is managing the patch management, let's say, and if it goes back to that customer story we were just speaking about, where they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of servers and a lot of concurrent users, even throughout the night, being able to take that mind off, now you can start to look at, hey, what's our biggest challenge within our environment outside of this? That's usually that part two that you don't get to because you're focused on part one. So I pose this question to chat. Chat, what's your biggest challenge? Especially from, let's stick with the security orchestration lens, right? Is it designing the workflow logic? Is it integrating multiple AWS services together? Or is it getting the time to understand the human in loop part of it? Because what we've seen with customers is sometimes they can design the automation, but they can't focus enough to lock down to the point of, hey, we need a human to be that approval piece. And the argument can be made of, hey, we don't need a human here. That's great. But some regulatory industries, they need that human in the loop and their approval process to prevent malicious items from happening within the environment. Or just regular mill of who approved this? What is the audit trail? So all of this is getting to the point of, how do I reduce the grind of trying to figure out all these different pieces all at once? Well, by having somebody that you can take with you, like AMS, right, that can help you maximize your security XP in a certain way. So think of the operational things. We spoke about patching, but think about CloudWatch alarms. Think about AWS backups. Think about instance lifecycle management. You might say, all those things related to security? I would say yes. Just from the perspective of your CloudWatch alarms, go to the dashboard or application health checks and so on and so forth. These are all intertwined because you start to get into the operational items, right? The operational metrics of the mean time to detect, the mean time to respond, the overall patch compliance. Those are things that take up some time, especially when you have to answer from an auditing standpoint. And when you get to that point that is taking up time, then you can't focus on, hey, what's the 12 to 18th month strategy that we have within our environment? I think that's an important part to consider. So as you start to go down this route, but hey, can we do some certain things? And we have a question, Aries. Sorry to be basic, but where AMS pipelines and human in the loop, and where can agents be used? This is a great question because it is a combination of things, right? Because AMS can help you support it, right? Think of that managed services standpoint of patch management and things of that nature. Can you have, let's say, agents take care of this part? That's part of that automation discussion, right? Usually there's two sides of the coin. There's the technical side and then there's the governance side. Sometimes they don't align properly, right? And that's why I keep moving my hands like that. But when they do, it's a great thing because now you can move, let's say, your workflow to from theory into practice. And that practice component can be with an agent or maybe with AMS or with your own internal resources, depending on what it is, right? So what you start to get to is understanding the scale of your overall operation. And what we're trying to achieve is, how do you scale without scaling necessarily the headcount, right? Because you want to make things more efficient. So if you have 10 to 20 AWS accounts that you manage manually and going through the console and do all these things, well, maybe with AMS, you can have that same team oversee 100 plus accounts, because AMS can handle the baseline pieces of it across all of them. And then AMS can help standardize some of those run books to make sure that the consistent security operations are handling or being handled throughout the environments, so that you don't have that feeling of beating, right? You feel that music, and you say, hey, I have to take care of this. We have all this to go, right? Little things like that. And then all of a sudden the music stops because you had to take that pause. And I think the important part of that is knowing, how do you proceed? One, you can quickly, upskill everybody and have some certificate knowledge. Or, as we like to say on the safe room with side quests, is go on a knowledge quest, right? And what is a knowledge quest? Well, it's those pieces of documentation, those pieces of reading, those pieces of videos that you watch. After your 5 a.m. run, you grab and you take a look at your laptop and you say, hey, I need to learn a little bit more. Well, that's where a knowledge quest comes in, because what does it do? It helps you just to maybe build aura, right? And that aura component is something you could take away. And we already started to do that with just reviewing, hey, what's the incident response guide say? The other piece of that is delving back into, what are the fundamental items, like the security pillar and the AWS well-architected framework, right? And the part that we usually focus on here is some of the security foundations. Again, top priority, top bullet. But what is governance? And let's take a second to zoom into that, right? Because what you want to do when you get to the governance aspect is take that step back, right? See, the hearts are running out. They're running low. But when you start to take that step back, you think of, do I understand from a security governance standpoint how I manage my security posture within my environment? Or am I still at the level of just level 100, apprentice mage? And this is what a knowledge quest is. How do I get from the level 100 to beyond? Well, the first step is identifying your current maturity model. And some of the best ways to do that is to look over your target state security strategy, but also looking at, hey, how much help do we need? And again, this kind of starts to move us towards that piece, because part of this is, hey, AWS account management. This is just general account management, setting up the workloads and using them separate. And you can get into this with the SRA, the security reference architecture as well. But the key piece I wanted to pull out of this is, how do you operate your workload securely? Well, this is part of it. This is a big part of the conversation. It's getting to the point that you understand, hey, I know I need to stay up to date, but is there anyone that can take me through this in such a way that it helps me, rather than saying, here, this is some additional items? Do we have someone that understands our workload criticality, right? And this is where you can leverage something like AMS, because it can help with your, valuable production workloads, to the point that, hey, I can focus on items like setting up more automations or Event Bridge or different pieces of the puzzle that go into automation and security orchestration workflow, right? So that you can eventually go from apprentice mage, as we spoke about last week, to more of a spell weaver. You connect the different pieces of the puzzle together. And now you can start to work with, okay, now I'm a little bit more mature in my journey. I can start to take some of the feedback, take some of the pieces that we iterated upon, and maybe look into, as we call out, SCP examples, right? Or just plain old troubleshooting SCPs. It's like, hey, I'm up leveling to the point of now we got past the basis. Now I can start to manipulate the fundamental items, because apprentice mage, I would make the argument with, is going to read the book. And this is a spell that we should do. But when you get to that 200 level, now you're taking that spell and manipulating it in such a way that I can take out the fundamental pieces to say, hey, when we're looking at this, why do we have resource star? Shouldn't this apply specifically to maybe one or two resources within the environment? It's just interesting, because with this, it's like, okay, everybody can describe, and then they can't do anything else. Those are pieces of the logic puzzle that you start to get to, that eventually you lead up to the point that you go a little bit deeper beyond that, and you become somewhat of a legend. And that legend usually stems from understanding the security foundations a little bit more, right? Understanding the building blocks. So one of those building blocks is, hey, using AWS organizations. And this is how we segue back into it, because AWS organizations, different accounts, you're already set up for success from just a multi-account structure, just from having all these different accounts provisioned within your environment. But now, if you take that step back, you start to get to the point of, hey, I'm a legendary mage, but I'm only a mage of one. I'm only a security personnel of one. How do I get some more party members? Well, I think that's the answer to what we were trying to go down today. The way to restore your mana or your energy or your focus as a legendary mage is to get some additional help. And that additional help can be something like AWS Managed Services, because it can fill in those gaps where maybe you lack the depth, because maybe you're a fire mage and you need a water mage to do whatever, right? I keep the analogies going to keep everybody interested. But it boils down to that 24/7 coverage, the specialized expertise, things that, and people that you can rely on. Just like you can rely on this show to keep leveling you up 1 XP point at a time until you level up your security posture and your security mind. And as I channel my inner Russ, I would say also leveling up your security incident response plan, because you kind of see how it ties all together. And then take it, discuss it, have a conversation with the MS team. And maybe we'll dive in with one of those team members. I have some thoughts. And maybe we'll pull Russ back in next week. And until then, I would say feel free, dive in, understand, and keep leveling up and keep on side questing. So until next time, have a great day. Happy Monday. Take care.